How's it going, everyone? This is the George here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Blue Beetle. This is the next DC movie, the second to last DCEU movie, maybe the first DCU movie, although James Gunn said Superman Legacy is technically the first film, but he also said this version of Blue Beetle is going to continue in his DCU. We're still trying to figure that out, but this is the next DC property movie to come out and stars Solo Maridueña, sorry if I mispronounced that name, as Blue Beetle, or Jaime Reyes, who just recently graduated college and he returns to Palmera City only to find out that his family is financially struggling and he's taking on work that he obviously didn't go to school for, but when he's entrusted by Jenny Cord to protect the Scarab, it bonds with him and he becomes the new Blue Beetle. And even though this isn't the Ted Cord version, the Ted Cord version is referenced throughout the film a lot and was the previous Blue Beetle. Also starring in this film is Bruna Marquezine, sorry if I mispronounced that name, Susan Sarandon, and George Lopez. And this is coming out at a weird time for DC movies, because obviously the James Gunn DCU reboot was announced early this year. DC movies have not been doing so well in theaters. There's been a lot of box office disappointment, particularly with Shazam! Fury of the Gods and The Flash that came out this year. Those movies got mixed responses. And while I have enjoyed those movies, they're not the best DC movies. The Flash, the previous DC EU movie, while I personally enjoyed The Flash, it's not the greatest movie ever as it was being hyped up to be, and had a lot of problems with special effects. The special effects in that film are not good and is considered one of the biggest box office bombs ever. And this movie was not tracking well for opening weekend at the box office. And this is coming out at a time where the actors can't promote these movies because the actors are on strike. And I still support the actors, but because of the strike, they can't market this movie or do interviews for this movie, which could use all the marketing it can get. And even before the actor strike, the marketing just wasn't quite there. I mean, the trailers were fine. It wasn't that the trailers were bad, but obviously they did make this look like a generic superhero movie, and there wasn't a whole lot of marketing just in general. And this was a movie that was actually going to come out on HBO Max, but then they decided to put in theaters. And Blue Beetle is not exactly a household name like other DC heroes. I mean, Blue Beetle, while I'm pretty sure he's more of a household name than some of Marvel's characters like Shang-Chi, any of the Guardians of the Galaxy before the Guardians of the Galaxy movie came out. Blue Beetle isn't Wonder Woman, Aquaman. Obviously, he's not Batman or Superman, but he's not even on the level of Flash, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman. And if a movie about the Flash could bomb, what's going to happen with Blue Beetle? And overall with Blue Beetle, I did enjoy this movie a lot more than I was expecting to. I do consider this one of the better DCEU movies. If this is considered a DCU movie, I know there's a lot of confusion. And I will say this movie does a really good job of standing out, not feeling like it's part of a cinematic universe. So you can consider it a DCEU movie or a DCU movie, especially because, as I said before, Gunn did say that Solo Maridueña will continue playing Blue Beetle in his universe, which I'm glad because he was awesome in this role. I love him as Miguel in Cobra Kai as well. So he's a fantastic actor. He's one of the best young actors, and he did a great job in this movie. But basically, this movie reminded me of the classic solo superhero films that didn't feel like it had to be a world-ending scenario where you don't need to rely on cameos from other heroes or a supporting role from other heroes. Now, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy some of those movies. I like Thor Ragnarok, which had the Hulk as a supporting character. I like Captain America Civil War, which had most of the Avengers and other Marvel heroes besides just Captain America. But I also miss the classic solo films that just focus on that hero that the movie's tiled after. movies like the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, the first Iron Man movie, Man of Steel being purely Superman. The last one was the Batman based on Batman, and that's in its own separate universe away from the DCEU. So I'm glad that Blue Beetle, outside of just referencing Superman, Flash, and Batman, we don't rely on appearances from them. And we don't see the pictures of the Ben Affleck version of Batman or the Henry Cavill version of Superman or the Ezra Miller version of The Flash. It's kind of left up to us to decide what version they're talking about. Could they be talking about the DCU future versions of these characters or the previous versions? But outside of that, yeah, they reference the fact that Ted Kord was the original Blue Beetle. And I think if you're a Blue Beetle fan, I'm not a diehard Blue Beetle fan, but I enjoy the character. I think you're going to love this movie. You're going to love the references to Ted Kord and how this version of Blue Beetle is portrayed. But trying to get back to my mindset, but yeah, this is a pure solo superhero film. It also will feel like a generic solo film in the same way that the first Iron Man film, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, and Ant-Man did. This will probably feel more like an MCU movie than any of the other DCEU movies. That I will say. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it does take away from the uniqueness that a Blue Beetle movie could have been. Now, the unique thing about this movie is the family dynamic, the Reyes family dynamic. And I love this family. Like the way they work together, the way that they care for one another. It's kind of established, and you see Jenny Cord, wanting that herself. She's had a lonely life, and she sees Jaime Reyes' family and sees how close they are despite not having that much money. And it shows just how important family is. Not trying to be like Vin Diesel from Fast and Furious. And if that's one thing that the DCEU movies have done pretty well with, it's been a family dynamic. For example, the Shazam movies, the highlight for those movies for me was the family dynamic. And in Blue Beetle, it's the same thing here. The other standout of this family for me was George Lopez playing Rudy, the uncle. And I grew up watching the George Lopez show on Nick at Night, the reruns on Nick at Night when I was a preteen, when I was a teenager. And I find George Lopez to be hilarious. And he did not disappoint as the crazy but caring uncle. Some of the way he delivered the lines reminded me of George Lopez from the George Lopez show, so I enjoyed that. He carries the humor. This is a funny movie. They don't overdo it with the humor, though. And that's one thing they did better than a lot of MCU movies. It's that they didn't overdo the humor, because that's a problem that MCU movies have when they follow this formula. They can sometimes overdo it with the jokes, and they didn't do it with this movie. One thing that did feel formulaic was the villains, particularly the bodyguard Ignacio, who has similar technology to Blue Beetle. So basically Susan Sarandon's character and her bodyguard want the Scarab to power this army that she wants to form to basically to impose imperialists, police on this city, on this country. And so obviously the technology is going to be similar. So if you're going to hear comparisons to Ironmonger, to Killmonger, or Yellow Jacket, that's fair game, because it did feel that way. I will say, though, that this bodyguard character, Ignacio, there was a little bit of heart to this character because he has a tragic backstory that I felt like they could have done more to explore. I mean, the way they handled it at the end was okay, but I felt like you could have explored that earlier on, or you could have given more hints. Like, you see a couple of hints throughout the film, but they're brief hints, and it just felt like they waited until last minute to establish that tragic backstory. As for Susan Sarandon's character, she's Jenny's aunt, Victoria Cord, and I mean, she wasn't a terrible villain. She was a mid-level villain. I'm gonna be honest. I felt more intrigued by Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor for Batman v Superman, as much as I'm not a big fan of that version of Lex, even though I have no problem with the Ultimate Edition of BVS. I still wasn't a big fan of Lex. I thought though Lex was a better billionaire villain than this character was. Uh, and speaking of the niece, Jenny Cord, who is also the daughter of Ted Cord. Bruna Marquezine. So, once again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. She does a very good job playing this character. You sense the loneliness of her because her father went missing and how bitter she is towards her aunt. I will say, though, about her aunt, they captured how bitter the aunt was towards Ted Cord because, minor spoiler for the film, but she thought she was going to get the company at one point, but then Ted Core got the company and was going in a direction that was the opposite of Victoria Cord's direction, which was obviously a more imperialist, more aggressive direction. So I liked how they did capture the motivation and the anger and bitterness that character felt. The Blue Beetle costume looks awesome, as well as the other as the costume for Ignacio, his Blue Beetle copy costume. That looked pretty cool as well. I will say that. The special effects are a lot better in this movie than the Flash. The action was also pretty good as well. I did like the action. Even the use of practical effects worked very well in this movie. It's crazy how this movie, which was meant to be an HBO Max movie at one point, well, at first, did better with special effects than the Flash movie that had a bigger budget and was supposed to be the movie that David Zaslav thought was going to make him a ton of money for Warner Brothers. And I'm not saying Blue Beetle is going to make a lot of money because so far it's off to a iffy start, but still, this movie had a lower budget and was meant to be a streaming movie, and it had better special effects. I will say it was going fast paced for the first half. It felt like it was going at a quick pace for the first half. Second half, it started to slow down a little bit, but there was never a dull moment. It knows when to have emotional moments and when to have the humor. And there is a mid-credit scene with this movie. And I'm really hoping that they don't, even though they're going to keep Solo Mariduena in the DCU, I hope they don't reboot because I like the direction that this movie's going. And I think there's a lot of potential with this cast to keep going forward. I think there's a lot of potential for a Blue Beetle franchise to do very well. And I like the Latino representation in this movie. And I hope this movie makes more money so we can get more representation. And I felt like Blue Beetle, I thought like Jaime Reyes and his family, this is one of the more relatable characters in DC movies because this is about someone who just graduated, who thought he was on top of the world. He was the first of his family to graduate college, and then he comes back and here's all this family trouble that's going on and these financial problems, and he's dealt this really rocky hand in trying to provide for his family. So I liked how relatable this movie felt, just in general. But overall, Blue Beetle to me is definitely one of the better DC movies in the last few years. In the entirety of the DCEU, it's one of the better movies. It's not as good as Shazam as far as a family movie goes, but I still think it's high up there with Shazam as being one of the better DCEU movies. The villains could have been better. I think the motivations were there and the backstory was there, but they could have explored it better. I enjoyed the action. I liked the effects for it. The Blue Beetle costume looks awesome. Zolo Mariduena is excellent as his character. George Lopez provided some of the best comedy in a DC movie or DCEU movie. And overall, I'm gonna give Blue Beetle a B plus. Obviously, if you want something unique, this may not be the comic book movie for you because it does feel similar to a lot of the origin superhero solo movies that we've gotten, particularly from Marvel, not really DC. That's one thing I will say DC does pretty well with. They tend to usually have unique solo movies. This isn't one of them, but it's still a solid DCEU movie or DC movie. At this point, we don't really know what's going on. And by the way, there is no Ben Affleck recording in this movie. I know that was something that was brought up on Twitter. A certain scooper brought that up, and James Gunn debunked it. But what are your thoughts on Blue Beetle? Did you love it? Did you hate it? And please go check out this movie. Support good comic book movies, because this is one of the better comic book movies we've gotten this year. Let me know what you think about Blue Beetle, and are you excited that this version of Blue Beetle will continue in the DCU? Let me know in the comments down below, and I want to thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe already if you haven't. Please share this with someone that loves Blue Beetle and DC, and I hope to see you guys real soon. Take care, everyone.